G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and so far you are having a brilliant week. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. But this video today, I think you're going to have to watch the majority of it to make sense of some pieces. Now you and I, we talk about war, attritional war, protracted war, as a holistic battle of nations. Tactical victories lead to strategic victories to operational victories, of course, then to influence politics. They're very fundamental of war. The war is politics by other means. Of course, you can replace the word victory there with losses. You get the same idea of how war is won or lost and how war is used as a tool of diplomacy, as a blunt force instrument. So we're going to talk about a lot today. We're going to look at the map situation, what is occurring. We'll look at the maps. We'll look at geolocations to confirm tactics being used or locations. We'll look at the war situation, how different states have created parallel realities of what is going on. What the EU is saying about the war negotiations, peace proposals, what maybe America is saying, and maybe where we see how this is actually being used, that this is a little bit more cunning than what it may seem on the surface. We'll of course look at Steve Witkoff's phone call. Now the reason I bring up about this holistic view is today's video, I think you're going to have to watch the majority of it because we're going to call back to many pieces as we go because it is in order, but we need to build up to get to some other bits. Of course, there is this incentive for you to stick around, or for me, for you to stick around, because YouTube in the algorithm, its most important metric is how long someone stays on your video. And I think I'm getting absolutely smashed in the algorithm recently. I think we've had some cracker videos with terrible rankings, but that's fine. Thank you all for being here. So before we get into the video, I asked yesterday, I had this write-up and I couldn't find the original of it, and it was off Mr. Doomberg's Substack, so thank you for that. Please go and check that out. That was about analysts and advocates. So before we get into the maps, let's actually look at the map situation, how people are seeing this differently. So I got sent this across from someone who helps me behind the scenes sometimes. As I said in Feb 2022, and keep saying, this war ends at the Dnieper River. Anything Ukraine holds to the east of that is victory in itself. The Taliban got there for nearly 20 years and claimed victory by survival because the West got bored and left. Of course, we're not going to see a war of insurgency like this. I'm pretty sure Ukraine can claim a victory by not only surviving in some areas, but thriving in a conventional war against an overwhelming conventional force. By holding back this wave and not just relying on an insurgency after an initial overall defeat. This is something we have spoken about though, is terms of victory we had seen were very set in stone of nothing but these borders, nothing but then Putin in The Hague, and those terms of victory are starting to get shifted, but very slowly, but I don't think there's going to be wider acceptance of anything but that because we're told again and again and again, whatever it takes, however long it takes, and that this is imminent and is the way forward, that there's no other way. It says Zelensky talks of dignity, and we see time and time again, Zelensky is always dignity, rather than setting a victory goal, it is this, is we need our dignity. Pretty sure the armed force of Ukraine did enough to hold their heads up high and proud. They beat the odds and most expectations. They surpassed every expectation in this war, from Washington, 3 days, within Kyiv, within of course, the Kremlin, and within every other state as well. And that has to be something to be said for this war as well. Let's have a look at this. Mr. Michael McPhail, a professor of political science and a senior fellow at Stanford University. He says, so many pretend generals on this platform claim that Ukraine's army is on the verge of collapse. I talked today to a senior Ukrainian official on the front line who painted a different picture. Times are tough, manpower shortages are real, but collapse is not just around the corner. And if US provided more air support missiles for F-16s, the situation could improve rapidly. So, firstly, a senior official directly on the front line, okay? Sure. I agree, there's a lot of online generals as well. Funny thing is, a lot of wannabe generals are better at assessing the situation than real generals, as we have seen. But what I will say, Michael, speak to a soldier about what is actually lacking on the front line, as I have done since the beginning of this war. Every time I speak to them, none of them give two shits about F-16s or Abrams or this or that. What they need, what they have been screaming for, is basics. More men, more drones, more night fighter equipment and thermals, more ammo, rotation, logistics. That's what they're after. That's what could affect the front line. F-16s, these are flying around trying to intercept Iran drones. Even if you pumped in double the amount, that's going to take years, mate. Like, it's not painting a reality of what's going to shift. And again, like everyone on the front line says, it's being ignored what they actually want. They go, why is Zelensky taking photographs in a fighter jet when we don't have enough ammo to stick up the spout of a mortar at the moment? So we can see where some are analysing this. Let's look at then Mr. Driscoll here too. Now, he's the US Army Secretary, Daniel Driscoll. He has pretty much replaced Keith Kellogg in these negotiations here. He's an Iraq War veteran, and he's very close friends, I believe, went to university with the Vice President, J.D. Vance. But in a meeting with Kyiv, he delivered a very grim assessment. He told them their troops faced a dire situation on the battlefield and would suffer an imminent defeat against Russian forces, saying the Russians are ramping up the scale and pace of their attacks, or aerial attacks. They have the ability to fight on indefinitely, and also the situation would only get worse over time. It was better to negotiate a peace settlement now rather than end up in an even weaker position in the future. He's also said the American defense industry could not keep supplying Ukraine with weapons and air defenses at the rate needed to protect the infrastructure and population. Now, the US may be able to, but again, the US is very extended into other areas of the world, some of which are heating up. Kyiv officials viewed this as capitulation to Moscow. This is why we saw that then shot down, and 28 points went to 19 points, and I guarantee that will go nowhere. One of the sources said that the message was basically, you are losing and you need to accept the deal, or it's going to get worse and the US may pull back. We will see what comes in meetings in the future. But again, that's going to be important for what we talk about further, and also this will be important about Pokrovsk as well. We speak about Steve Witkoff's phone call. Now, what people are saying is, well, it's a distraction from the situation on the front line. Now, it's not that as a primary cause. It may be a byproduct of it. But it is interesting, if we just pick at that thread a little bit, that no pro-Ukrainian channel is actually talking about Pokrovsk like it doesn't exist. And what we see is all these other bits spoken about, but not if you are a YouTuber, a blogger who looks at maps, looks at whatever, and if you look at how then the battlefield affects negotiations, diplomacy, you can't ignore the situation down here, which is catastrophic. We see Mr. Bro, nothing talking about Pokrovsk. We see Mr. Warburg, nothing talking about this. And this is what is happening. This is why we say that the best disinfectant is sunlight. And what we'll see, again, is another pocket, another no step back, another catastrophic situation, because no one is willing to bring sunlight to this. Therefore, there's no accountability for what is a catastrophe. It's even a catastrophe if deep state is right, which deep state is. This is why we use it. It's a baseline. This is best situation possible, because, of course, this is tied in with the Ukrainian ministry. And, of course, the Ukrainian ministry and Ukraine in general and Kyiv is in a crisis at the moment with the American peace proposals. We see the amount of massive corruption being exposed. So this, if we're controlling this, they'll try and show the best picture possible. Even this looks like a catastrophe. We see the red check. Of course, this red check indicates ground made over 24 hours, moving on the eastern side and in Pokrovsk center itself. This red check has been put here due to that geolocated footage of the Russian soldiers walking around in Pokrovsk yesterday. Now, what I'll say is that footage did not show any signs of being on the zero line, and that the red is likely much further ahead of that sector. Let's have a look at a couple of other maps. We see both Suryak, AMK, who reputationally, in my opinion, are significantly more accurate than Deep State, but we still doesn't meet our threshold to show and confirm advancement. We see Suryak talking northern side of Minograd, ground being made, southern side, further ground down around that base of the envelopment that has occurred, encirclement that has occurred, therefore squeezing on Minograd sector. AMK, he shows this squeeze even further on the eastern and western side, and a break into Minograd on the western side and on the eastern side, and squeeze down on that, further shrinking the size of it. As we know, everything from Fab 3000s to Fab 500s to all sorts is just absolutely punishing the center of Minograd on that Pokrovsk sector. Before we go north, let's just go west. Udashny, we see this mine here. This is a very, very important mine. A lot of these mines around here, there was talk of this in the minerals deal, but likely they'll come under then Russian control. We see in this direction, he's saying out of Udashny that the Russian forces in the direction of this coal mine just here outside of then that grey zone. Let's come to the northern sector. Sofivka, Shakovka, Island, boys of Pankivka hanging out, and also Dorozhny, somewhere to be familiar with. We look on then the Suryak maps, and he's showing more ground made to this reservoir and going then east to west across Sofivka. Let's have a look at then Mr. AMK's map. Again, same reservoir, east to west, moving across Sofivka, Shakovka, that there has been an encirclement here, further pushing to the west, but also from Nikhorovka to Dorozhny, there's been more ground, he says, made in this direction as well. Remember, this is the side we saw that Russian breakthrough up to Zoloty Kolodyar's 15-20 kilometres. And what I think is, although that got pushed back, as we have seen right here, I think that is the crystal ball of what is to come in the next 6 to 12 months. So that is Pokrovsk. But Pokrovsk is not the area that concerns me the most. The area that concerns me the most and is existential for the linear warfare bros is, of course, the Guliopol front line, the Velika Novosilka whole area we speak of course, heading in the direction of Zaporizhia. And we see this not only moving every day, but moving very quickly, and that this map by geolocations is significantly behind. Why are we critical of that? We understand informational warfare, it's part of war. The reason I'm critical of it is we know that Ukrainian forces reported on this front line have such bad communications that they're relying on this map, and this map is showing significantly incorrect, even by geologs. So Guliopol down here, let's have a look. Let's firstly look at Suryak maps. This now isn't the easiest to see. He speaks about DRG's begun operations in these sectors, but you can get an idea. So this is Guliopol right down here, and then this is moving right up through where somewhat the grey zone is here, but then further, look at Novo, Zaporizhia, Radinske, where we had, of course, and Razne, we saw geo confirmations in here that this whole sector is then pushing west and is very different to what this map is showing. In some sectors around Novo Zaporizhia, between the maps is up to 13 kilometers different. Now, why is that believable? Well, we did see geo confirmations out past 10 kilometers different on these maps. A little bit easy to see with some of the labelling is then the Mr. AMK. He says, as Guliopol collapse continues, the Russian progress remains largely unimpeded. And we've seen this is a shitload of fortifications in here are just being crossed at a more rapid pace. Of course, Guliopol right down here, he says about DRG have intensified their activity within the city limits and further pushing around. This is Novo Zaporizhia in here and what is just south Dobropilia as well. So you can see this is Dobropilia, Novo Zaporizhia, Radizne. Sorry, it's a bit blurry, but you can see all this ground being made down here. This is why I say the November kilometre squares different will be the largest disparity between Deep State, AMK and Suryak that we have seen so far in the war. Now, we know how Russia takes these areas, that it holds troops in, destroys them with large munitions, DRGs break in, work on the flanks. I've done a specific 10-12 minute video on that. I believe if you click on my profile, you'll see that straight away. And we see Guliopol with the same again. We see right in the center of Guliopol, we see then multiple FAB 500 munitions then striking in this sector. And of course, holding place with drones, once statutory, then destroyed with heavier artillery. And again, FABs work in many ways like artillery. So do drones, but it's highly effective, highly efficient artillery too. But we're not done on this sector yet. Let's look on the west side of Velika Novosilka, just the north of where we were. Look for Tikhi up here and Veliko Myalakivka in here. Apologies, I added a couple of Ks and Ys in that, but you understand what I'm talking about. We see AMK saying Tikhi is under Russian control, and on the eastern side of Veliko Myalakivka that the Russians are moving up the Vovcha River, which is right in here, and as well in Tikhi. Again, we had geolocations in Tikhi the other day, which is at a minimum 9.6 kilometers behind the shown line. So that is continually moving. And the expansion of ground here should be very, very concerning. We move just to the east of here. We'll zoom out so you can see where we are, where my cursor is. This is where we're coming. Ivanivka, Novopavlivka, of course, where we saw the first mechanized successful assault in a long time around Novopavlivka in this direction. Similar time we saw the one in Malatokmachka down near, Kyiv too. We see this. So firstly, Novopavlivka, that the Russians are working west-east, expanding the base, expanding the girth. Girth is more important than length here. And why? Well, like we speak about, that if you push out in a way, if you push north, you need to go east and west. Otherwise, you risk being vertically enveloped by drones or artillery, the exact opposite of an envelopment. Ivanivka showing that Russia controls the majority of it, but that Ukraine has taken back some of the western outskirts. Again, not shown in any of the grey on these maps. Okay, so before we look at more maps, because of course maps will determine a hell of a lot to do with the battlefield, but we need to look at how people are seeing this. So, Mr. Mick Ryan AM, upgrade on the OAM, but he's a retired Australian Army Major General. He has tweeted this: one of the clearest logical thinkers and strategic communicators on why Russia must not win, Miss Kaya Kallas. So let's actually have a look at what she says. We'll go through fully on this, that we still need to get from the situation where Russia pretends to negotiate to a situation where they need to negotiate. So by strengthening Ukraine, get Russia to a point at which they are coming to the table, knees shaking, hands are weak, spaghetti on Putin's bloody top. Therefore, he's in The Hague, 1991 borders, that it's on Ukraine's terms. Okay, let's have a look at what she's actually said. Now, firstly, what I know is heaps of advisors charge incredibly high fees to come and speak and give opinions. And they've obviously created a parallel universe through their own echo chamber. If like the EU wanted a reasonable but contrary opinion, they can call me a prick all they want afterwards, it's fine. I'll cover all my own costs to come to Brussels. Why? Because I don't want to see these fools in an echo chamber extinguish a state for their own goals. Vanity. So she says, an immediate unconditional ceasefire must be the first step to ending the war. Russia is not winding down its military machine, but ramping it up. We still need to get from a situation where Russia pretends to negotiate to a situation where they need to negotiate. Funny, it's coming from the same mouth that told us about out of munitions, collapse, dishwashers, washing machines back now almost 4 years ago. Russia's summer offensive has failed. US-EU sanctions are having a huge impact on the Russian economy. To increase the chance for peace, we need to increase the pressure on Russia. The notion that Ukraine is losing is also flat out false. Now, what I'll say is the notion that Ukraine is winning is also flat out false. Please, if you disagree with that, give me a metric. Give me a metric that is measurable, that goes with theory of war, that goes with doctrine that Ukraine is winning. Territory, not a great metric for attritional war. Losses, not a great metric because all the numbers are highly likely bullshit. Look at fire superiority, movement, etc. Schwerpunkt, all of that we can look at. Now, Putin cannot achieve his goals on the battlefield, so he'll try and negotiate his way there. Of course, what this is a misunderstanding of war, because if you can achieve goals diplomatically, you will do it, because war is the last diplomatic tool in your toolbox. And of course, it's very messy, very expensive, very unpopular. But this just doesn't understand that attrition is aimed at destroying potential. If Russia could conquer Ukraine militarily, it would have done so by now. What they're trying to do, they may have been trying to do that in the beginning. Once we saw that not being a possibility, the attritional war is there to destroy any potential of future too. Also has no understanding of attrition, how that works, no understanding of that war is politics and how Russia uses war and still sees war as a legitimate tool of politics, which we do as well. We just hide it under the guise of spreading democracy and liberalism, and how they use this holistically from tactics to strategy to operational victory, then to politics. And people just don't like it when that is in the other way. Now, to secure the best outcome for Ukraine and Europe, we have to stay the course and pick up the pace. This means more sanctions to deprive Russia of the means to fight. So another 20th sanction package. What I'll say is, agreeing with Zelensky's former press officer, you don't actually have a plan for victory in here. In the European Council, we pledged to cover the financial costs for Ukraine in 26-27. The reparations loan is the most clear-cut way to do this from the frozen assets, but we need to make that decision fast. Of course, Belgium is not too keen on this because we know from economists and others speaking about this, it could end up catastrophically expensive. We all can work, the coalition of the willing, to hammer out the details of military support to Ukraine, but security guarantees to Ukraine do not change the fact that the threat really here is Russia. That we need further guarantees, all this, but seeing that Russia is still the threat. So in any peace agreement, we have to put the focus on how to get concessions from the Russian side so they will stop aggression for good and do not try to change the borders by force. So saying that we need to show no borders can ever be changed by force, which is, I always find funny coming from European states. But either way, and I don't agree with borders being changed by force as well, but it's just funny given the history there. But also that we need to focus on, in the agreement, it's Russia making all the concessions, Russia coming to the table in all of this, to a situation, quote, where they need to be the ones negotiating, but also maximalist demand. And what I'll say is the EU and Ukraine's demands are significantly more maximalist than Russia's. The 24-point peace plan from the Europeans was incredibly more maximalist than the 28-point plan allegedly between the Americans and the Russians that was agreed to. Way more. I showed you in the calculations using a point system how that is so. Now, there are rarely wars in the world where the situation is so clear-cut as it is here. Actually, no, all war is very, very opaque, including this one. Russia, the aggressor, must do not what Ukraine, the victim, must sacrifice. That's where the focus should be. Now, what I'll say is even if it is as clear-cut as whatever, it's still irrelevant when we talk about terms of power on the battlefield. That Ukraine is the right self-defense and nothing with Ukraine, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So we're talking ideals versus reality here, and this idea that just right is might. And lastly, the threat posed by Russia extends beyond Ukraine. That is also why decisions concerning the EU and NATO must be made only by members of the European Union and NATO, nobody else, excluding, though, the members that may disagree with the other states, if you're Slovakia or Hungary. And of course, this idea that Russia is going to sweep across Germany. All this work is ultimately about ensuring that Russia never attacks again. We're in favour of a peace plan that will bring just and lasting peace for Ukraine, but also ensures security for Europe tomorrow. And the idea in this is, as long as Russia exists in some level of the state, they're saying there will be a threat there. And this is why we're highly critical of a lot of these plans, because we see it as number one priority, trying to weaken Russia, regardless of what the future for Ukraine is. We'll talk about that in a sec. Now, a question was asked, the details of the preparation of the peace plan from the US. And she says, also we confirmed the media that all the points favour Russia. There's not one single concession or obligation from the Russian side. This is just objectively incorrect. In the original 28-point plan, there was a small to medium Russian lean by our 6 points. The 24 plan was 20 points Ukraine's way. But this is as expected given the battlefield. Now, there's no concession. All the points favour Russia. Well, actually, let's have a look at some of the points, Kay. Number 5, Ukraine will see reliable security guarantees. US and NATO allies would treat an attack on Ukraine as an attack on the entire transatlantic community. That doesn't sound super like a pro-Russian point. Number 4, frozen funds, and I believe it's 14, frozen funds will be used as follows. 100 billion frozen assets will be invested in US-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine. So $100 billion isn't nothing. 10, if Russia invades Ukraine, in addition to decisive coordinated military response, all global sanctions will be reinstated. So basically an Article 5 style response. This is where I just think there's this gulf between there's a parallel reality that's being created. It's either being created in a pseudo environment of echo chamber or this very cunning plan to we don't care what the future of Ukraine is as long as we can weaken Russia. And I wanted to go through this today. This is by this gentleman here, Arne, I believe, on then Substack. So please go and have a read, look up these, support everyone I bring in this, even those that I criticise. Now, Europe pushing Ukraine's, I can't say that word on YouTube, apologies. Reality is only truly observable by those with eyes to see and ears to hear, with an agenda that must deny obvious truths with a willingness to recognise facts disappear, replaced by callous cynicism. The situation occurring now in respect of the leadership of the EU and Ukraine is supremely unidentifying sight. On the surface level, we're all invited to believe that the current crop of European leaders, at least those in the EU, Britain, Germany and France, have the best interests of Ukrainians at heart. This is what we criticise. It seems this way, but we don't believe it. We think it's fairly Machiavellian. However, look a little deeper and you'll find this isn't so at all. In fact, their every statement, policy decision, appeal to act is to the massive detriment of the Ukrainian people and only serves their own narrow interests. Now, I believe in the beginning it did start wanting to support, and now it's gone, this is the best way to weaken Russia, which obviously, as Kaja Kallas says, is an ongoing threat. The paragraph above will be immediately rejected by anyone who is so totally emotionally committed to the idea of supporting Ukraine and defeating Russia, and who subsequently believes that those spoken of above are the potential saviours of Ukraine. From them, Ursula von der Leyen, Keir Starmer, Friedrich Merz, Mr. Macron are absolutely heroic due to their defence of Ukraine. But they could not be more wrong or misguided in this respect. These political figures, who such people admire so much, are directly implicated in the deaths of both Ukrainians and the potential death of their entire nation. And this is what we're critical of time and time again. There's no real plan moving forward in here. You don't understand the fundamentals of war. Or do you really understand this and it's evil? You understand that war is politics, so you have, by reducing Russia's power, you have Ukraine step into a war for you. And this is ultimately what this gentleman is criticising. Contrary to the incessant optimism of Western politicians and media pundits and the websites they frequent, where a constant upbeat message concerning the Ukrainian conflict is heard, the reality of the battlefield tells a completely different story. And this is what we say. It's a completely different story. Things on the battlefield are going from bad to worse for the Ukrainians due to the Russian army having finally broken through the majority of extremely strong fortifications set up by the Ukrainian regime and NATO sponsors since 2014. The Ukrainian army is in fact within months of total collapse. Now, it's not through all of them, but it has been moving through a heap of them. Now, I don't believe that we are within months. I think it's going to be further away than many, but the trajectory is definitely going in that direction. I often think, what's going to happen first? A collapse tactically on the battlefield or a collapse of narrative? While the defeat of the Ukrainian regime and its forces becomes more obvious by the day, the Russian army is taking more ground inexorably, and with casualties, desertions and surrenders rising in a Ukrainian army falling apart, and with every possible feasible game-changer weapon having been supplied by the West, what do we find the European sponsors advocating? So all the game changers have been given, and anyone who talks of future game changers, you're at least 18 months away with any of these. And we do see desertions, AWOL, of course, rising massively here. No one wanting to fight. You're fully relying on people literally dragged off the street. What do we see the Europeans now advocating? Basically, carry on dying and losing land. Let's all just do more of the same. Instead of confronting battlefield realities now quite clearly and ever more evident on the battlefield, these cosseted European elites find it far more comfortable to ignore all of them and hold fast to their totally false narratives. Narratives that maintain a fantasy world that for now works only to protect themselves, their reputations and institutions such as NATO. Their policies are in no way to protect Ukrainians. It's quite the reverse. And that's what we say. That militarily for the EU, for NATO, this war is not existential. Ideologically and reputationally, absolutely it can be. This is why they're holding on with everything they can, but also wanting to weaken then Russia. But the expense of Ukraine, I don't think they're considering. Once a 1,000-kilometre line of serried fortification lines is terminally broken through at the most strategic points, there will be little but bare fields for the Russian army to traverse until it reaches the banks of the Dnieper River. Of course, where many say that this war is going to end, and as we see, this is why the Southern Front concerns us so much, is the remaining fortifications here are getting less and less and less by the day, as it's basically one large flank manoeuvre. Russia has every possible military advantage over the rapidly shrinking military power of Ukraine. This is where I say, give me a metric. If Kaja Kallas or whoever is saying that Ukraine is objectively winning, give me a metric. This is one of the many factors Western audiences are kept totally ignorant of by Western political and media elites in terms of troop numbers, air power, drone, artillery, missile arrays, munition supply, logistical support, and troop morale. Russia is supremely dominant, and it shows. Although some will say the morale in the Ukrainian forces now is at the highest it's ever been, which is a ridiculous statement from someone who should know better. There is not the remotest possibility the Ukrainian army can halt the now quickening Russian advance, let alone take back lost territory. Yet the Europeans want this path of the Ukrainians on to continue indefinitely. And this is what we've said. Ukraine at the current moment can't stabilise this. There's no actual military plan to even stabilise what is going on. Now, I know Mr. McFarlane, he's talking, more F-16s. More F-16s is still a hell of a long way off, more munitions. It will have zero effect actually on the front line. The only thing that could stabilise is a shitload more men, shitload more artillery, a better supply, logistics and rotation. But we're talking massive, massive amounts. And that's just to the theory of stabilisation. Nothing to actually pushing back and taking territory. Talk of ceasefire, heard for so long now from the Europeans, is simply code for freezing the present situation where the Ukrainian army is being defeated in order to re-equip, rearm, reinforce with the view of continuing to initiate the war once more at a later date. Now, yesterday I misspoke, but I meant that Russia sees this as a way to freeze the war, shoehorn in more weapons, potentially EU militaries into here. They're not interested in that. This is totally obvious to anyone paying close attention rather than believing in fairy stories told by Western mass media. The Russians, he says, want a negotiated end to the conflict. If they can do it through negotiation, they would rather do it through war. That is the whole thing, that war is your last tool. But if you can do it diplomatically, everyone will do it that way. They just make out like that Putin wants more war just for the sake of war's sake. No, if he wants to influence politics, he will resort to war if needed or continuing war if needed, regardless of the cost. But if you can do it negotiated, no one wouldn't. They've stated the terms. The Russian-speaking Donbass need to be recognised as part of the Russian Federation. Ukraine would never join NATO, and Ukraine to be demilitarised. Now, again, this is number one, is Western influence in militaries in then Ukraine. It's not just NATO. It is any Western military influence. We've spoken about that, but that is the point. That could be a one-point peace plan because Ukraine and Russia are never going to agree on that until there is an unconditional surrender. While the Europeans oppose the inevitable outcome, above they will continue to urge Ukrainian people to continue committing in this unwinnable war. There are no scenarios where the Ukrainian army can hold its present positions, none where it can maintain its manpower, none where it can receive the amount of weaponry or ammunition it needs, and none where the morale of its troops can effectively be raised. In realist terms, I agree with that. Is it brutal? Yes, but I agree that we're not seeing any strategy to actually fix these issues. The fact is that everything has been tied to Ukraine's Western sponsors and everything has failed. It is a crystal clear, transparent fact that any deal offered by Russia in the future will be worse than available now and that was available in 2015 or 2022. And people complain that it's worse than back then because the battlefield is worse. And highly likely in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, it will get worse and worse and worse, if not existential. Will the regime leadership finally put the interests of the Ukrainian people first rather than their own or its sponsors? Or will it continue sending its population to die in a war already lost as well-heeled European elites urge them? This is one of the big problems that Ukraine has. Firstly, there's no election, so the people don't get a say. But secondly is Ukraine's Schwerpunkt, even Kiev's Schwerpunkt, their centre of gravity is not in Kiev. It's outside. They're very beholden to these European or Western leaders. So to actually make a decision here is going to be very, very difficult. Like we saw back in 2022 when Mr. Boris Johnson came in and upended everything. If Zelensky looked at the US plan and said, yeah, this is pretty good, does Europe come in as the fat chick with a hot friend who says she's not interested? It definitely seems that way. Quickly back to the maps, Witkoff's phone call, maps, and then we will finish. Let's go into Bakhmut. Let's look at the northern sector of here. We have Mayskay down in here, Minkivka, Privlia, areas which you probably are not familiar with, but we haven't seen this area move in a very long time. Someone talking about it. Funnily enough, Suryak AMK, they've shown around Mayskay and then to Zaleniskivki area here. I can't pronounce that for the life of me, but in this sector is actually starting back up. Why? Well, this is the southern side of Seversk. Suryak, he's saying the same, this area and around Mayskay as well. So let's then talk, let's finish the maps and then we'll look at the Witkoff phone call. So Seversk, let's have a look at this and where things are moving, the southern side. So we have this whole Soledar, Bakhmut southern side, then through Vlaminka into Seversk. We can see all the grey zone through Seversk, this whole area up here. Let's then look at AMK. Now, the best way to do this is we have Seversk, look at where these two reservoirs are. This is said reservoir and then said reservoir down in here. Just gets you a basis of where we are. So more around that bottom southeastern pocket, then a break-in on the northern side of Seversk, as we have seen, a break-in on the southern side as well. Keep a massive eye on what is happening around here. Of course, this feeds into then the Liman front as well. We see on then Syriac maps, we see where Liman is to the east of here, near Novoselivska, small bit of a Russian ground being made. Stavka, Ukrainian advancement here, as well as Ukrainian advancement just in Liman itself, and a small Russian advancement down around the Yampil or Zakitny section, more by that map, but nothing too major. Now, let's push down south, and then we'll spend the rest of the time in the north. Konstantinivka area, again, like a lot of Ukrainian officers are saying, is all roads lead to Konstantinivka. Let's have a look here. That AMK is showing that to the western side of this waterway, and the Russians are continuing to push, as well as break into the southern side and build that base around Konstantinivka, as we have said, with how you fight a war like this, especially with the risk of vertical envelopment. Let's push up into the north. Now we see Kupiansk sector, we see then the Pishane area. If we can zoom in, out, not going to pop up for us, but let's have a look. Kupiansk right in here. We have Pishane, Kupiansk, where Ukraine has had an advancement back in this sector. Pishane right in here, Kurylivka coming back under Ukrainian control. Let's come then into Vovchansk. Now, this is an area where AMK, he raised the alarm far before people like me or anyone else that I'd seen. Firstly, let's look at Syriac. He's showing movement through basically the remainder of Vovchansk, but also down into the next area here of Teshchelny towards Vilcha as well. Let's look at then Mr. AMK. He's showing fairly similar in the direction of then this Vilcha area too, but less of the center under control, but this continual movement out of here. As we saw a Ukrainian blogger say recently, that Russia's not trying to take Vovchansk, they're trying to bypass it like other areas, which fits within the tactics that we have seen develop, evolve, and be used on the battlefield. So the Steve Witkoff call. Now, I think this is getting a little bit blown out of proportion. Do I think it's important? Yeah. Do I think it is this massive world-changing thing? Not really. Knowing how some of these deals are done behind the line, behind what we see. But this is coming from The Guardian. Who leaked Witkoff's call advising the Kremlin on how to get Trump on side? It's hard to speculate. It could be 100 million different things, including somebody on the Russian side trying to hurt Witkoff's reputation from a former CIA Moscow station chief. But there's no obvious motive for Moscow to have compromised Ushakov, a key aide to Putin, and Witkoff, Russia's friendliest interlocutor in the Trump administration. Now, I don't brush past this. Done correctly, leaked from the Russians, this destroys trust between, if it can be hidden that it was not the Russians, if you can leak it as if that it was Ukraine or the Europeans, it can destroy trust. It can throw a spanner in the works for both Ukraine and Europe as well. People say Ukraine may also have the motive to make the call public. Kyiv extremely uneasy with Witkoff's role in negotiations and would be keen to undermine his position. Absolutely, it could be that. But the risk of a catastrophic bust-up with the Americans, if caught, would probably give Ukrainian officials pause for thought. Not really with operations when we look at, say, like Nord Stream, but it could be catastrophic if it gets found out. This is with all then intelligence operations. It's always risk versus reward. Most likely it's also someone inside the US system, of course, with the encryption of this. Apparently it was done over WhatsApp. My strong suspicion is that this came from the US side, from the official CIA, NSA. There are many people, the US intelligence agencies, unhappy with the current administration. It'd be a difficult, potentially extremely dangerous move for a disgruntled employee. Absolutely, you could find yourself in a world of hurt. One notable detail is Bloomberg obtained audio of the recording rather than just a transcript of the call. Suggested the source was either directly involved in intelligence collection or senior enough to obtain a raw audio. I haven't seen the raw audio, but I've only seen the transcript. If there's audio, that'd be interesting too. Another former intelligence official suggested a European intelligence service, horrified at Witkoff's pro-Russian position, was most likely to be behind the leak. That's where I think would be probably most likely here. But again, you're treading a very dangerous line. What makes the publication so surprising is that the interception of Witkoff's calls was the part of long-standing penetration released by the information would probably cause him to change his device communication habits, thus close down a fruitful intelligence window. It's completely unsurprising the number of agencies might have got hold of the recording, but it's extremely surprising that someone would leak it. And this is more what pricked my ears up with this too. Is once you show that the phone is compromised, everything's going to lock down. So everything you'd been collecting until this point, what could have been fantastic intel, is now cut off at the knees. And there'll be an internal investigation in here. And if they find someone or an agency, it will be, well, there's foreign intelligence operations that compromise basically the entire US elite on an island anyway. So I guess we'll see. Donald Trump defends envoy Steve Witkoff after leak alleged he advised the Kremlin aid. Now, it does seem that Trump doesn't really care that much, saying it's what a dealmaker does. He's got to sell them to Ukraine. He's got to sell Ukraine to Russia. And this is why I was somewhat unsurprised by this, is I think Trump has seen the dodginess of back deals here, that it's not as diplomatic as people would like. Am I saying it's right? No, I'm saying it's the way things are done. It sort of actually is. Now, what this has done is it has decimated, destroyed the US 28-point peace plan, and it has left Witkoff's credibility in negotiations in ruins, although Trump doesn't seem too concerned with it. All you need to look at is look at pro-Ukrainian Twitter and all the Democratic senators or politicians, whoever, and you'll see that the absolute nightmare scenario and informational war that this has got. And again, when you're analysing this, look at who it benefits. So the outcome of this basically sabotages any US proposal. Who do we know not wanting the US proposals? You get more of an idea. So you can definitely see why the Europeans could be interested in this. They want to continue the war and have a weaker Russia at the end of it. But you cannot count out the Russians leaking this to further seed distrust between the US and its allies at a very tense time. I'm not putting that off the table. Done correctly could be very, very useful. Mr. Noah reports, he says the US believes it was Ukrainian intelligence that recorded the leaked Steve Witkoff's call with Putin's aid, according to journalist Serhiy Sidonenko from European Pravda. Again, that's where I believe you would look first. The danger in this is huge. Again, will we ever know? Likely not. Does it matter if Trump doesn't think it matters? Not really, actually. It sort of reduces it, but you can see the uproar amongst everyone that this has then caused. So you get an idea of where it may be sitting. Anyway, legends, have a fantastic day. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.